Perhaps no community has suffered more for the sake of the beetles world than Sheldon and eastern Illinois and adjacent areas in Iroquois County. In 1954, the United States Department of Agriculture and the Illinois Agriculture Department began a program to eradicate the Japanese beetle along the line of its advance into Illinois, holding out the hope and indeed the assurance that intensive spraying would destroy the populations of the invading insect. The first eradication took place that year when Deldrin was applied to 1,400 acres by air. Another 2,600 acres were treated similarly in 1955, and the task was presumably considered complete, but more and more chemical treatments were called for, and by the end of 1961, some 131,000 acres had been covered. Even in the first years of the program, it was apparent that heavy losses were occurring among wildlife and domestic animals. The chemical treatments were continued, nevertheless, without consultation with either the United States Fish and Wildlife Service or the Illinois Game Management Division. In the spring of 1960, however, officials of the Federal Department of Agriculture appeared before a congressional committee in opposition to a bill that would require just prior consultation. They declared blandly that the bill was unnecessary because cooperation and consultation were unusual. These officials were quite unable to recall situations where cooperation had not taken place at the Washington level. In the same hearings, they stated clearly their unwillingness to consult with state fish and game departments. Although funds for chemical control came in never-ending streams, the biologists of the Illinois Natural History Survey who attempted to measure the damage to wildlife had to operate on a financial shoestring. A mere $1,100 was available for the employment of a field assistant in 1954, and no special funds were provided in 1955. Despite these crippling difficulties, the biologists assembled facts that collectively paint a picture of almost unparalleled wildlife destruction that became obvious as soon as the program got underway. Conditions were made to order for poisoning insect-eating birds, both in the poisons used and in the events, and motion was applied at the rate of 3 pounds per the acre. To understand its effects on birds, one need only to remember that in laboratory experiments on quail, Deldrin has proved to be about 50 times as poisonous as DDT. The poison spread over the landscape at Sheldon was therefore roughly equivalent to 150 pounds of DDT per acre, and this was a minimum because there seems to have been overlapping of treatments along field borders and in corners. As the chemical penetrated the soil, the poison beetle grubs crawled out on the surface of the ground, where they remained for some time before they died, attracted to insect-eating birds. Dead and dying insects of various species were conspicuous for about 2 weeks after the treatment. The effect of the bird populations could easily have been foretold. Brown thrashers, starlings, meadowlarks, grackles, and pheasants were virtually wiped out. Robins were almost annihilated, according to the biologist's report. Dead earthworms had been seen in numbers after a gentle rain. Probably the robins had fed on the poison worms. For other birds, too, the once beneficial rain had been changed through the evil power of the poison introduced into their world into an agent of destruction. Birds seen drinking and bathing in puddles left by rain a few days after the spraying were inevitably doomed. The birds that survived may have been rendered sterile. Although a few nests were found in the treated area, a few with eggs, none contained young birds. Among the mammals, ground squirrels were virtually annihilated. Their bodies were found in attitudes characteristic of violent death by poisoning. Dead muskrats were found in the treated areas, dead rabbits in the fields. The fox squirrel had been a relatively common animal in the town. After the spraying, it was gone. It was a rare farm in the Shelton area that was blessed by the presence of a cat after the war on beetles was begun. 90% of all farm cats fell victims to the Deldrin. It was a rare farm in the Shelton area that was blessed by the presence of a cat after the war on beetles had begun. 90% of all farm cats fell victims to the Deldrin during the first season of spraying. This might have been predicted because of the black record of these prisons in other places. Cats are extremely sensitive to all insecticides, especially so, it seems, to Deldrin. In western Java, in the course of anti-malarial program carried out by the World Health Organization, many cats are reported to have died. In central Java, so many were killed that the price of a cat more than doubled. Similarly, the World Health Organization spraying in Venezuela is reported to have reduced cats to the status of a rare animal. In Sheldon, it was not only the wild creatures and the domestic companions that were sacrificed in the campaign against an insect. Observations on several flocks of sheep and a herd of beef cattle are are indicative of the poisoning and death of freight and livestock as well. The Natural History Survey report describes one of these episodes as follows. The sheep were driven into a small untreated bluegrass pasture across a gravel road from a field which had been treated with diligent spray on May 6th. Evidently, some spray had drifted across the road into the pasture, for the sheep began to show symptoms of intoxication almost at once. They lost interest in food and displayed extreme restlessness, following the pasture fence around and around, apparently searching for a way out. They refused to be driven, bleated almost continuously, and stood with their heads lowered. They were finally carried from the pasture. They displayed great desire for water. Two of the sheep were found dead in the stream. Two of the sheep were found dead in the stream passing through the pasture, and the remaining sheep were repeatedly driven out of the stream, several having to be dragged forcibly from the water. 3 of the sheep eventually died. Those remaining recovered to all outward appearances. This, then, was the picture at the end of 1955. Although the chemical war went on in succeeding years, the trickle of research funds dried up completely. Requests for money for wildlife insecticide research were included in annual budgets submitted to the Illinois legislature by the Natural History Survey, but were invariably among the first items to be eliminated. It was not until 1960 that the money was somehow found to pay the expenses of one field assistant to work that could easily have occupied the time of 4 men. The desolate picture of the wildlife loss had changed little when the biologists resumed the studies broken off in 1955. In the meantime, the chemical had been changed to the even more toxic Algin, 100 to 300 times as toxic as DDT and tests on quail. By 1960, every species of wild mammal known to inhabit the area had suffered losses. It was even worse with the birds. In the small town of Donovan, the robins had been wiped out, as had the grackles, starlings, and brown thrashers. These and many other birds were sharply reduced elsewhere. Pheasant hunters felt the effects of the beetle campaign sharply. The number of broods produced on treated lands fell by some 50%. The number of young in a brood declined. Pheasant hunting, which had been good in these areas in former years, was virtually abandoned as unrewarding. In spite of the enormous havoc that had been wrought in the name of eradicating the Japanese beetle, the treatment of more than 100,000 acres in Iroquois County over an 8-year period seems to have resulted in only temporary suppression of the insect, which continues its westward movement. The full extent of the toil that had been taken by this largely ineffective program may never be known, for the results measured by the Illinois biologists are a minimum figure. If the research program had been adequately financed to permit full coverage, the destruction revealed would have been even more appalling. But in the 8 years of the program, only about 6,000 was provided for biological field studies. Meanwhile, the federal government had spent about 375,000 for control work, and additional thousands had been provided by the state. The amount spent for research was therefore a small fraction of 1% of the outlay for the chemical program. These Midwestern programs have been conducted in a spirit of crisis, as though the advance of beetle present and extreme peril justify any means to combat it. This, of course, is a distortion of the facts, and if the communities that have endured these chemicals drenchings have been familiar with the earlier history of the Japanese beetle in the United States, they would surely have been less acquiescent. The eastern states, which had the good fortune to sustain their beetle invasion in the days before the synthetic insecticides had been invented, have not only survived the invasion, but have brought the insect under control by means that represented no threat whatever to other forms of life. There has been nothing comparable to the Detroit or Sheldon springs in the East. The effective methods there involve the bringing into play of natural forces of control which have multiple advantages of permanence and environmental safety. During the first dozen years of this entry into the United States, the beetle increased rapidly, free of the restraints that in its native land hold in check. But by 1945 it had been a pest of only minor importance throughout much of the territory over which it had spread. Its decline was largely a consequence of the importation of parasitic insects from the Far East and of establishment of disease organisms fatal to it. Between 1920 and 1933, as a result of diligent sending throughout the native range of beetle, Some 24 species of predatory or parasitic insects have been imported from the Orient in effect to establish natural control. Of these, 5 beetles well established in the eastern United States. The most effective and widely distributed is a parasitic wasp from Korea and China, Typhia vernalis. The female Typhia, finding a beetle grub in the soil, injects a paralyzing fluid and attaches a single egg to the undersurface of the grub. The young wasp, hatching as a larva, feeds on the paralyzed grub and destroys it. In some 25 years, colonies of Typhia were introduced into 14 eastern states in a cooperative program of state and federal agencies. The wasp became widely established in this area and is generally credited by entomologists with an important role in beginning the beetle under control. An even more important role has been played by a bacterial disease that affects beetles, so the family to which the Japanese beetle belongs, the Scarabiidae. It is a highly specific organism attacking no other type of insect, harmless to earthworms, warm-blooded animals, and plants. The spores of the disease occur in soil. When ingested by a foraging beetle grub, they multiply prodigiously in its blood, causing it to turn an abnormally white color, hence the popular name milky disease. Milky disease was discovered in New Jersey in 1933. By 1938, it was rather widely prevalent in the older areas of Japanese beetle infestation. In 1939, a control program was launched directed at speeding up the spread of the disease. No method had been developed for growing the disease organism, and an artificial medium by a satisfactory substitute was evolved. Infected grubs are ground up, dried, and combined with chalk. In the standard mixture, a gram of dust contains 100 million spores. Between 1939 and 1953, some 94,000 acres in 14 eastern states were treated in a cooperative federal-state program. Other areas on federal lands were treated, and an unknown but extensive area was treated by private organizations or individuals. By 1945, milky spore disease was raging among the beetle populations of Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. In some test areas, infection of grubs had reached a high as 94%. The distribution program was discontinued as a governmental enterprise in 1953, and production was taken over by a private laboratory which continues to supply individuals, garden clubs, citizens associations, and all other interested in the beetle control. The eastern areas where this program was carried out now enjoy a high degree of natural protection from the beetle. The organisms remain viable in the soil for years, and therefore becomes to all intents and purposes permanently established and increasing in effectiveness and being continuously spread by natural agencies. Why then this impressive record in the East were the same procedures were not in Illinois and the other Midwestern states where the chemical battle of the beetles is now being waged with such fury? We are told that inoculation with milky spore disease is too expensive, although no one found it so in the 14 eastern states in the 1940s. And by what sort of accounting was the too expensive judgment reached? Surely not by any of the assessed the true cost of the total destruction wrought by such programs as the children of spraying. This judgment also ignores the fact that the inoculation with the spores need to be done only once. The first cost is the only cost. We are told also that the milky spore disease cannot be used on periphery of the beetle's range because it can establish only where a large grub population is already present in the soil. Like many other statements in support of spraying, and this one needs to be questioned. The bacterium that causes milky spore disease has been found to infect at least 40 other species of beetles, which collectively have quite a wide distribution and would in all probability serve to establish the disease even where the Japanese beetle population is very small or non-existent. Furthermore, because of the long viability of the spores in soil, they can be introduced even in the complete absence of grubs. As on the fringe of the present beetle infestation, there too await the advancing population. Those who want immediate results at whatever cost will doubtless continue to use chemicals against the beetle. So will those who favor the modern trend to built-in obsolescence, for the chemical control is self-perpetuating, needing frequent and costly repetition. On the other hand, those who are willing to wait at an extra season or two for Full results will turn to milky disease. They will be rewarded with lasting control that becomes more rather than less effective with the passage of time. An extensive program of research is underway in the United States Department of Agriculture Laboratory at Peoria, Illinois, to find a way to culture the organism milky disease in an artificial medium. This will greatly reduce its cost and should encourage its more extensive use. After years of work, some success has been reported. When this breakthrough is thoroughly reestablished, perhaps some sanity and perspective will be restored to our dealings with the Japanese beetle, which at the peak of its depredations never justified the excesses of some of these Midwestern programs. Incidents like the Eastern Illinois spraying raise a question that is not only scientific but moral. The question is whether any civilization can wage relentless war on life without destroying itself, without losing the right to be called civilized. These insecticides are not selective poisons. They do not single out the one species of which we desire to be rid. Each of them is used for the simple reason that it is deadly poison. It therefore poisons all life with which it comes in contact. The cat, beloved of some family, the farmer's cattle, the rabbit in the field, and the horned lark out of the sky. These creatures are innocent of any harm to man. Indeed, by their very existence, they and their fellows make his life more pleasant, yet he rewards them with a death that is not only sudden but horrible. Scientific observers at Sheldon describe the symptoms of a meadowlark found near death. Although it lacked muscular coordination and could not fly or stand, it continued to beat its wings and clutch with its toes while lying on its side. Its beak was held open and breathing was labored. Even more pitiful was the mute testimony of the dead ground squirrels, which exhibited a curious attitude in death. The back was bowed and the forelegs, with toes of the feet tightly clenched, were drawn close to the thorax. The head and neck were outstretched, and the mouth often contained dirt, suggesting that the dying animal had been biting at the ground. By acquiescing in an act that can cause such suffering to a living creature who among us is not diminished as a human being,